Good afternoon again, everyone. And this is session 4, which hopefully is not going to be with the fireworks of the last one, but just as interesting. The chosen analog virtual author, Lavanya Lakshminarayan, discusses a futuristic novel with Avik Chanda, moderated by Aatreyee Ghosh. Lavanya Lakshminarayan is the winner of the Times of India Author Award, a Locus Award finalist, has also been nominated for the BSFA Award. Her short fiction has appeared in various anthologies, including the Golan's Book of South Asian Science Fiction, Volume 2. She's occasionally a game designer and has built worlds. I think that is it worlds? I'm a little challenged about this. So maybe it is built worlds for Zynga Incorporated's Farmville franchise, Matthew Wars, and other games. Avik Chanda is an author, columnist, and entrepreneur. His books include Anchor, From Command to Empathy, Using EQ in the Age of Disruption, and Dara Shuko, The Man Who Would Be King. He also conducts corporate training workshops. Aatreyee Ghosh is a project head at the ArtX company. With a PhD in Indian English writing from JNU, she taught at university before joining as the creative manager at Oxford Bookstore, where she helped curate and manage their 2 diverse literary festivals. She spent a sabbatical year working with the International Institute for Asian Studies in Leiden, Netherlands, as their fellow, studying the ways of representation of the Dutch in South Asian fiction. Good to have you both here, Avik, especially Aatreyee. This is another side to her that we're seeing today, and we'll be hooking up with, we do have her there. Lavanya, over to you.
Firstly, thank you so much for coming in today. It's a very interesting space to be in here today after COVID, after everything. And it's great to see so many of us all together celebrating the arts, celebrating literature. Hi, Lavanya. Can you hear us?
Hi, Aatreyee.
Okay.
I can hear you just fine. I hope
hear
you
you.
can hear me.
Yeah, now we can.
All right.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, may I make a request? There's a little bit of an echo. So Lavanya, while we are speaking, if you can be on mute, that'll be nice.
All right, sure. I hope that's not a technical issue because I was told earlier that if I hit mute, I'd have to join the call again. So I'm just going to check if it's all right for me to go on mute.
Go ahead.
You're already in the dystopian world that Lavanya very nicely about in analog virtual.
No,
Yeah.
she has to be on mute while you're talking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So just to start off, I have to confess something. I got to know Lavanya much before this book, especially because I was one of those people who would get up at 3 in the morning to harvest my crops in Farmville. So from Farmville to analog virtual, it's been a great journey. It's a very interesting journey, and I would love to hear a little bit more about that. What got this book to this world? What made you interested to write about this very complicated yet a world which is so true today? Like, it's not in the future, it's right now.
Thank you so much, Aatreyee. Like you said, I worked on Farmville. I've worked in game design professionally for maybe about 10 years. And while working on, the corporation that uses algorithms to create entertainment for people, it struck me just how deep we were digging into people's lifestyles, their kinds of behavior, and attempting to put them that curated their behavior, so to speak. So when you design a game, you have an intended experience that you want your players to go through. And everything about game design is about funneling players and shepherding them through this very specific experience. And so I worked on it in the capacity of games, but if we zoom out and look a little bit further on our patterns of media consumption and the kinds of entertainment and culture we consume and seem to echo almost, all of this is being managed in a very echo chamber sort of a space where once we state a preference or we show a tendency towards something, we are automatically given more and more of that to consume. And I think, what really interests me about this is it's a constant loop of instant gratification that we are trained to pursue. And this starts off really young, when we're in school, in fact, where we're told, okay, you know what, you get good marks, you get into a good university. Once that happens, we're told, all right, graduate with high marks, you get a great job. And once we're in a corporate environment, we are told to burn the midnight oil, to work weekends, so that we can get the bigger house, the bigger car. So we are on this, I think from a very early stage, we are tuned to pursue this sort of capitalist notion of what success is and what makes us valuable to our communities. And it's a very one-dimensional understanding of what this is. And the longer I worked on games, the longer I built things that simulated that in game worlds, the starker it became, and I felt like I just had to write about it.
Because you bring in the idea of, these levels, right, that constantly we are trying to reach the next level and so on, and this is where I'll bring Avik in, because your work in understanding corporate mindset, and now that you're working on the future of work in India, what did you think of the book?
I know everyone's been lauding this book as this futuristic dystopian vision. And for me, one of the most striking things and probably the most alarming things was that much of it, in its ethos, in its essence, is already a reality. And I wanted to start by asking Lavanya to share her views of just the basic rubric of it. We're talking about the corporatization of all facets of life, right? How much of that is almost a reality as we speak, even now?
Thank you so much for your kind words, Avik. I really appreciate it. And you're absolutely right. We are seeing, at least personally, I believe that a lot of this is very endemic to the world we inhabit in the present day. Now the book is set in Bangalore, and Bangalore has this Silicon Valley of India vibe, and everyone, by and large, inhabits a little bubble of what I like to call tech bro privilege, where you are almost siloed off from a lot of present day reality because you are surrounded with, to begin with, really high pressure jobs, this perpetually dangling ladder of success, the myth that is merit, through which you really believe you are getting what you deserve and hard work is all it's going to take. And in Bangalore, for example, it is impossible to walk into a coffee shop and not overhear 10 different conversations of various people pitching to investors or working on PowerPoints to investors. And, of course, I'm talking pre-pandemic, which is when I wrote the book. And then we went through the pandemic with the book releasing 2 weeks prior to lockdown. And I was somewhat horrified to see this become almost prophetic in that sense, because everybody was now stuck at home, living purely virtual existences. And while technology is not necessarily evil, it has enabled a lot of access for those of us with its privilege. It is predicated on the existence of that privilege. And so for every group of people who can, achieve their goals and continue making tons of money working from home, there are millions more who can't access education or who have been struggling to access education. And so we are living in this extremely split world, which, I started observing when I was writing the book, having come from a privileged bubble myself, growing up, in uh, I would say middle class, upper caste Bangalore, I realized just how much privilege I possessed and just how much that um, isolated me from a lot of what reality really is. And so you're absolutely right in the sense that we are there already. I've just taken where we're at and kind of projected it to the extreme, where it is a very overt capitalist corporation that runs the city in analog virtual. But right now, we are viewing the softer side of that. It's just dramatized, I would say, in my novel.
And quite prophetic in the way that it's come out in the light of more recent experience.
Yeah. Um, I'll just move to, I don't know how many of us here have read the book, and if you haven't, you really should pick up a copy because it's fabulous. And it's not, when I started reading it, I thought that it might be science fiction. It's not. It's our life right now. Anyone who's done their entire work from home experience where you're constantly a bubble in a Zoom screen, that is exactly what analog virtual is. The interesting part that I find in your book is you refer every chapter. I call it a chapter because I think it's actually a novel unto itself rather than short stories, right? Every chapter begins with these really prophetic kind of aphorisms, almost statements, and each of them harks to a literary allusion or to a cultural association. Like I could literally see Margaret Atwood in there. I could see, I think Avik saw, you said you saw
Dylan Thomas.
You saw Dylan Thomas. So
Into That Good Night.
yes, was that something which you were doing knowingly? Like almost like red herrings in your story, right? Like Easter eggs that people could find and say, oh, I know what you're talking about. Or was that something which was very subconscious, unconscious addition to this?
Oh, thank you so much. No, it was definitely, I would say, a part of it just felt subconscious because it felt like that was the most apt expression for perhaps the theme of the story or the theme of that chapter or the experiences that someone was going through in that chapter. And I think, we are all resting on the shoulders of giants. There are unbelievable writers who have come before across genres, whether we're talking Dylan Thomas and poetry or Margaret Atwood and speculative fiction, we all rest on the shoulders of giants. And when someone has said something so succinctly, it was almost a bit of a tribute from me saying, thank you for coming before. Thank you for inspiring me in me a love for this language and a love for the written word, which I can then, in my own small way, contribute to by writing this book.
I thought there was a particularly studied astuteness to some of these allusions. So, for example, when you say, to everything turn, 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 right? The interesting thing for me was not that quote, but that you said it's an ancient proverb, right? Which tells us on the one hand that we're living in a time in which Pete Seeger is ancient, but when we understand that Pete Seeger himself took, except for the words first, turn, 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 pretty much the rest of it is all copy-pasted word for word from Ecclesiastes in the Bible. So it's ancient to the power 2, right? So twice removed. And I thought that was something which was very insightful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you found the little Easter eggs because that's what I was attempting to do, especially with that instance that you point out, where we are right now, it's already ancient pop culture in some ways. But like you said, Pete Seeger took it from the Bible. And in sort of denoting it as an ancient proverb, what I was trying to do was create a sense of time, to one say that this has been set in the distant future, but also somewhere reflecting upon how the worldview itself of the era of analog virtual, which is the worldview, the corporate worldview of Apex City, has come so far from that verse in Ecclesiastes, from what Pete Seeger intended with his music, to a place where this natural turning of cycles and seasons and a time for everything um, is no longer valid. It's all about instant gratification, and we need this now, and your performance in the moment is the only thing that matters. And you are always living on a bit of a knife's edge. So thank you. I'm so glad. I'm so glad you spotted it.
No, taking from something that you just said about pop culture, that's something that comes up quite often in the book, right? What's the right music to hear? What's the current favorites? What should you be listening to? How you build up a persona, which kind of really reminded me, or very badly reminded me of the Instagram reels that you see, right? Like songs which for us maybe meant something else. Now a certain part of it is taken and it means something completely different, where these 16-year-olds are saying this is where you came from, this is where you now, and it's supposed to be a sarcastic song in the first place. So the notation or the understanding of pop culture itself and how it changes and how it is being used by the governing the powers to be to, I shouldn't just like not only flush out a kind of subversion, but also make everyone think the same. I found that fascinating, and I would just love to know if what is happening in the social media world today, let's say even with Meta coming in, right, and so much of analog virtual is about exactly what Zuckerberg is creating, right? How much of that has an effect on how you write or how you perceive this or create this world, which in a way is futuristic?
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. A lot of it was informed by the way we are consuming pop culture right now, where things trend and then they fade. And a lot of, I would say, well, I would say, for years on end, but specifically right now, whether you are in, or I would say whether you are with it or not, really determines whom you can access and your coolness factor and what sorts of social strata you can spend time with, you can have a conversation with. And this is very prevalent, in, for example, in games where I had a lot of these experiences. There would be a lot of people who were very exposed to, let's say, Western pop music, right? And they would have their own little clique. And then there would be people from more Indian centric backgrounds who couldn't relate. And you could just see this massive divide being drawn. And right now, this divide is being drawn very softly. As I said, through the algorithms of our preferences, we're kind of kept in these little silos through the way media trickles down to us. But I thought, what would it be like if it became sort of state sanctioned in some ways, or in this case, corporation sanctioned, where the appropriateness of what you're consuming really determines your access to privilege. It determines your access to very elite circles. One of my chapters, the second chapter in the book, in fact, has a character who is being retrained because he loves inferior music, and he's up for a promotion to this very elite, circle of society. But in order to fit in with them, he has to completely rewrite his opinions on music and appreciate more elite music. And it's a pretty stark chapter, and it's not very subtly done by the corporation in this case. But I feel like in our present day reality, it is being very subtly reinforced in the kinds of things that wind up being memes, in the kinds of things that wind up being popular, and in the kinds of things that wind up being underground and edgy. And it is almost very rare to see overlaps between all of these interests, because we are being, I would say, trained to exist in these loopy silos, where once we have stated a preference, that's all we're going to be exposed to. And that's quite tragic if you ask me, because there's so much to be experienced.
I'm going to pull in Obi, you here, because your work has also kind of done exactly what she's saying, like, taking up, I wouldn't say pop culture references, but cultural references which have now been seen as, negative cultural references, right? And you are writing about them, like Dara Sukho being the best example. In your work was such an eye-opener for a lot of people who hardly know anything about that man, about what his legacy is, and yet have an opinion about it, right?
Yes.
So what goes into, writing people or writing characters who are already such popularized myths and then breaking that myth?
I think just a process of discovery and wanting to go behind or beyond the stereotypes, because there are a lot of these stereotypes. I mean, you could talk about Darashiko, you could talk about Ghalib, you could talk about Hazrat Amir Khusro, and it's a very long list, long and illustrious list, and it's or Akbar, right? And sometimes he's deified, and sometimes now he's vilified, and they have these seesaw of fates, right, depending on so many different factors. But I think what is abiding is the urge to explore, to try and get at the truth, and which I think is very much at the heart of the project that Lavanya has also done, right? To get at the truth behind motivations, behind this anti-corporatization. One of the things that I'd done in my previous book is to look at the role of emotional intelligence, EQ, or empathy. And my main submission was that in India, we've come really a long way in terms of tools and technology and frameworks and processes and all of that, right? But we've probably done that at the expense of human connect. And that entire sense of empathy or EQ is missing, and what the fallout of that is. And we see a very strong parallel of that, right? So there is a huge, risk reward and reward and punishment kind of mechanism, which is, on the one hand, you have this tremendous technological sophistication in Lavanya's narrative, but on the other hand, the way that the corporate, the Bell Corporation, instills and enforces this is fairly primitive, is Pavlovian, right? You are just, so long as your work, as your wisdom, as your experience is useful to us, you are useful to us. After that, you're completely dispensable. And although there are promotions and there are these brownie points, and then you go up to the higher echelons of the top 20% of the entire populace, there is no empathy. There is no sense of human connect. And I thought that was quite striking. Lavanya, would you sort of want to comment on that?
Thank you so much, Avik. Yes, I'm so glad you said empathy, because while I was writing this book, it was really important to me to bring out this absolute lack thereof of empathy, because as you have rightly pointed out, we've got so many technological advancements, so much, I would say, funding going into furthering technology. But its uses, I would still argue, belong to such a tiny subsection of reality that's inhabited by such a tiny populace, especially given the sort of disparity that exists in India. And all our technology is practically designed top down, barring, of course, there are projects that start at a more grassroots level. But if we're talking about the technologies that get massive corporate funding, that are most widespread in their development, they're the Swiggies of the world, and the Amazons of the world. And while I can't discredit their uses, I still believe, they cater to such a small section of society. And it is almost as if, without belonging to a part of India that's already in a position of power to state your demands or to state what you require through technology, it is impossible for you to be heard. And this is, of course, a two-way challenge, because I'm sure people who are starting these companies are also attempting to make business cases. But, that's where the problem really lies. Why can't we approach the power that technology can bring with a greater sense of empathy? with a greater sense of doing more for a wider subsection of, I would say, the human race, but here in India, with a wider section of the Indian people. Why is it so top down and so restricted to people who already have a ton of power and who are not necessarily representative of most of our population? And in writing Analog Virtual, I wanted to show or demonstrate a people who seem tremendously advanced in their sophistication and the sophistication of the technology, but who are fundamentally lacking in empathy and pretty savage because of it.
So again, just to go back to the literary illusion thing, and I'll come to the namesake story, right, Analog Virtual. The starting of it reminded me a lot of Camus' Stranger, where the person says, "My mother's dead," right? And the point of Stranger, or I think the vilification of the person, is because he can't show emotion, or he's not performing sadness or sorrow, right? Whereas in this case, she's not allowed, or she does not have the time frame or the mind frame to perform sadness, because the moment she's performing it, her productivity is going down. And I remember there's this one part where she says that, I wish I was like my father, who hardly showed any difference, and I'll go back to that productive phase and so on. So it's very interesting, like when when Avik talks about empathy, right? And I was also reminded of this thing that a friend of mine told me a few days back, where she went with a personal crisis to her HR, and the HR's first reaction was, "Why didn't you tell this to me when we were hiring you?" Because her first reaction was, "This is going to decrease your productivity," right? In a space like this, how far can the workforce really kind of go ahead without going through a complete burnout, right? And is that the future of work in not only India, but all over? Is that what you see? Is that what, Avik, you see?
I'll have Lavanya talk about it first.
Yeah.
No, it is a very pressing concern. I think over recent years, there has been a lot more conversation about the importance of mental health, all the way from school, right? Where, at least when I was growing up, teenagers having access to mental health care was just not a done thing, or it was very rare. Like, you had to be extremely privileged for it, and you still do. But at least there is dialogue taking place right now. And similarly within corporate environments. But having said that, it's still with that little rider over there, right? So long as it doesn't affect your productivity. Or, "Oh, I'm so sorry you're going through a hard time. Take 3 weeks off and come back, and then we will reassess whether it has affected your productivity in the months to come." And this is a massive problem. And you're absolutely right. In the story Analog Virtual, she simply isn't allowed to grieve her mother's death. She wants to, but she's very reluctant to, because of the terror of suffering the consequences should her productivity slip. And that kind of goes to show the full extent of the lack of empathy demonstrated by Bell Corporation, which is an extreme version, I would say, of the lack of empathy we do experience, in, I would say, in every kind of corporate environment. I can only speak to corporate experience, as it's the only kind I've had. But there is a certain sense of perpetual demand on us as human beings, where we are expected to do everything from, of course, having fulfilling personal lives to also killing it and working extra hours at work. And coming from a space like gaming, burnout is incredibly common. I think it's really hard to sustain a long-term career in that space, just because you're working weekends non-stop, you're working long hours non-stop, and I'm hoping it changes as dialogue around mental health becomes more common. But it's one thing to begin to talk about a problem. It's another thing to actually take the right steps in order to address it. And we're at that cusp where what we do next could really determine the future of work, in my opinion. I'd love to know what you think, Avik.
I think it was quite prescient, the that particular story, the entire thing around turmoil and internal stress, right? Internal strife, if you will, affecting one's productivity. And I know that all of this work was done and drafted and imagined before the pandemic, but what the pandemic has actually shown us is how ill corporates around the world, not just in India, around the world, how ill-equipped they were to deal with the human-centric crisis, the crisis of the human dimension, the crisis of trauma, of bereavement, of emotional and mental health. Because right on the waves, right in the wake of the actual, physical virus-led pandemic, there is the mental health pandemic that very few people want to talk about, and even fewer people want to actually address. I mean, we see a lot of that being reflected in corporate discourse, and a lot of the researchers and think tanks and the experts, they talk about the importance of resilience and grit and mental health and mental and psychological well-being in the workplace. But we are still very far away from actually being able to address that. And the fact that purely because of, and again, it comes back to economics, right? Because of economic reasons, the largest corporations of the world have in their wisdom decided to go permanently, or at least in the foreseeable future, in a hybrid mode of work, with several of the departments comprising thousands of people in their corporations not having to come to office. So therefore denying them access to human contact, because you're saving on costs, you're saving on overheads, and then you can continue to work from home, right? Great, that's the economic problem solved. It's cost reduction. What happens to the emotions of those people? What happens to the sense of loneliness and alienation? That is completely left unaddressed. And here it's seen as a sign of weakness. In Lavanya's narrative, it's seen as a sign of extreme weakness, right? As ineptitude. How can you even succumb to something like that? And the whole irony and the tragedy of that is that you're not succumbing to something that's weakness, right? You're displaying something which is essentially human. And that is seen as a frailty. That is seen as the biggest sort of drawback or lacuna. Right.
I'll just move a little bit to, the idea of performance that comes up again and again in the different stories. And one of the greatest performances is that of dissent. And let it be Tanya in, the persona, in the story of persona, social persona, or the disenfranchised teenager, right, where he's performing dissent by going to the right club, listening to that music, and being so pumped up about, oh, we will dissent, right? And the actual act of dissenting, which is so much tougher, which the first story is about, right? So looking again at what is happening all over the world today, right? The act of actual dissent and the act of performative dissent, right? Where does let's say, the idea of dissent work, individual dissent work in this world, in this futuristic world of both the story as well as what we see today?
I think that's fascinating to talk about because with the advent of social media, we see a lot more opinions being aired, and sometimes they are absolutely required. And one of the good things that comes off it is that we can question things that are unfair or totalitarian in nature, and make known our our presence as people who disagree with this sort of legislation. Having said that, though, there's, like you very rightly said, there's a big difference between tweeting about it and then, perhaps taking to the street to protest about it in a more physical way. But then there's the next step, of course, which is, are you in a position where you can influence public policy? Are you in a position where you can actually take affirmative action or steps that lead towards affirmative action? to correct injustice. Now, at least the way I see it in the present day world, all of these are so interlinked and interconnected. Um, because I would hope at least that gaining critical mass in terms of dissent on something like social media um, puts pressure on the necessary authorities to treat people with fairness, or makes them think twice about acts of injustice. Um, but that is my optimistic view of today's world. In the world of analog virtual, I think there is almost a zero tolerance policy towards dissent. It's viewed as something that is greatly detrimental to society. And I did want to take present day concerns. Where are these protests we are all part of going? Are we actually being heard? And I wanted to sort of project that in its darkest extreme, perhaps, by saying, you know what, nobody's looking, nobody's listening, except for a small set of people, and they will shut you down, because that is what happens in analog virtual. And without giving anything away, as you rightly said, that's what happens if you're a virtual. There's the story about the analog who, this teenager who's trying to find the right underground clubs where protests are happening. Again, that is performative. But then there are people who are genuinely working behind the scenes to attempt to overthrow this virtual stranglehold. And they're not doing anything glamorous. They're not necessarily in the public eye, but they are, working relentlessly behind the scenes. And I did want to sort of call attention to the fact that these are all forms of protest that exist in the world today. And I'm hoping, at least in our current reality, they're all more effective than they are in Apex City and in analog virtual, because analog virtual is pretty bleak.
I'll just move a little bit towards something which really kind of interested me in this book, and very few writers are talking about it even now, and that's climate change. One of the biggest things that comes out, and very subtly so in this book, is the effect of climate change, and what is the world that we are looking at. And with the summit happening right now, with Greta Thunberg, and the kids coming up and saying that, what is the world that we are inheriting? Was this a choice that you made to make climate change one of the major points in your book, or was that something which was incidental in your ideation of this future world?
No, it was definitely intentional. I think for the longest time we have been looking at climate change and saying, oh, the climate crisis is impending, but the reality is the climate crisis is very much here. And again, going back to how it is viewed, there is so much, I would say, responsibility placed on the individual to attempt to solve this problem. So, for example, and these are all good things. I don't mean to say they're bad things, but for every single one of us who does things like segregate waste, or switch off the lights, or conserve water, or rainwater harvesting, there are corporations spewing industrial waste into rivers and oceans. There's offshore drilling. There are pollutants being let into the air. And I really wanted to draw attention to, one, this is the fallout of climate change, because this happens after the Earth is in a massive climate crisis, exposed to ultraviolet radiation. And, there's a chapter in the book in which there's a drought incoming, but the people who fund technology say, oh, well, too bad. When is it expected? In 40 years. All right, come back to us in 39, which is the present day attitude of so many people in power, specifically corporations and also governments, when it comes to addressing a crisis that is very much here, whose effects we can already feel. And it's almost as if nobody really wants to take that responsibility, and it's just being bounced back at the individual, saying, all right, conserve water and switch off the lights when you leave the room, when there's so much more that can be done.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up a slightly different point here, and that goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier, the not just the degree of technology, but the range to which it's used. And one of these stories, one of the longest chapters, is a study of this person, very young person, who's training to be a virtuoso. But that person is training to be a virtuoso without the aid of technology, which is why it's 10 years into that making, right? In an Indian context, we'd call it talim, and 10 years is absolutely fine, except that here everything is accelerated. And I wanted to just sort of prefix or predicate that in the light of a little bit of research that I've been doing for my book. So now we know that models of predictive music. So for example, one particular phrase or phraseology or a section or sequence of notes informing the next sequence of notes in music has been around since at least the late 90s, right, or mid-90s. And right now where it's at, it's got to the stage where music reinvents itself through AI, creates itself through AI, and can also be used. Here's where it's really, sort of, it can be used to instruct. It can be used to aid. Now, there's a fine line. I'm using it to aid my instruction, and I'm allowing that to take over my entire being, right? So eventually what flows out of my fingers is nothing but what the machine has programmed, using my words advisedly here, right? Which this protagonist takes a conscious decision. That is the form of protest of that protagonist, right? And given that it's particularly where we are right now, purely in terms of AI-driven frameworks and technology for doing art, for doing fine arts, painting, installations, 3D, as well as music, it's not a million miles away, it's just a few hundred yards away from plant musician, right? And I was wondering, was that sheer imagination, or did a lot of your research inform those particular constructs in the narrative?
Thanks for drawing attention to that story. That's one of my favorites. It was a lot of fun for me to write because I love music. I learn classical piano, and I did, so something that has struck me again is the notion of what a double-edged sword technology is. When it comes to, for example, as you pointed out, making music learning more accessible. Now, for the longest time, the learning of music has been gated on a lot of privilege. You've got to find a teacher. You've got to have your instrument. You've got to be able to access both at the same time. And there is a whole bunch of theory associated with music. If you look at Western music, it's the ability to read sheet music. If you look at Indian classical, it's the ability to remember and replicate, right? And so from that point of view, technology can absolutely make music more accessible to a wider audience and train that wider audience. But at the same time, as you said, what is the cost? Am I just playing what the machine is telling me to play? If it tells me this is a pleasant sound, that's the only sound I'm going to be creating. And where is the independence of my expression as an artist? And in any sphere, the example we're talking about here is music, but it could be applied, as you rightly said, to art. It could be applied to writing. It is possible to train an AI. They're not doing it very efficiently right now, but plausibly in the very near future, they can be trained to produce works that read like Hemingway, for example. And so where does the sense of the creator come from? Where does the sense of self-expression come from if algorithms can break down what makes a sound pleasing or not, and then tell us, repeat this pattern on loop, and you play that, and you are a great musician. So the story was, to me, honestly, a very personal one, because this is something that I think about a lot as somebody who loves to create, who loves self-expression. The deeper my relationship with technology becomes, how does that in its own process start feeding back into me and change my worldview and the manner in which I create?
Thank you. I would just ask you to read a short passage and then we can open it up to the audience if they have any questions, if that's okay with you.
Yes, that sounds great to me. Thank you. I hope you can hear me all.
Get you.
I hope you can hear me all.
Yes,
Yes,
we can. Yes, now we can.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would love to read a passage from my novel. It is Analog, Virtual, and Other Simulations of Your Future. I'm going to be reading from the first chapter. It's called The 10th Thief. Nobody notices anything because nothing has happened. Not yet, anyway. This is how all things begin. The electric shield thrums ominously. It cuts Apex City in two, striking across the crater that was once Bangalore. She lives on the wrong side of the Carnatic Meridian. They call her Nayaka, their champion. They pledge allegiance to her. They're her people, the analogs. When Belcour ignored the cholera epidemic, she stole Meditech from their laboratories. When Belcour stopped funding their water treatment, she began lifting holowatches. If raid bots break into her pod house, they'll find the 140 square foot space filled with paperbacks. Nothing of value, no link to her crimes. She is discreet. Dead drops, paper money, 41 safe capsules buried underground. The virtuals know her as the 10% thief. They have a price on her head. Today she strolls towards the Meridian Gate. Pod houses form towering aisles. Their circular windows are eye sockets in fiberglass skulls. On their eastern walls, a well-known artist directs a crowd of analogs towards the completion of a mural. It reflects their past and celebrates their present. Children scurry to the Institute, a cluster of pod houses that lean in dangerously towards each other. It's architecturally unsound, but the children don't notice. A small playground made of scrap metal and junkyard finds is laid out before it. Trash can lids form the seats of swings. A slide is cobbled together from scavenged planks of wood. A solitary child sits on a merry-go-round made from the ancient remains of a satellite dish. Hawkers set up canvas tents along the path. They're selling homemade sunscreen and scraps of illegally procured Climatech fabric. A stab of guilt. She sourced that Climatech. They'll be arrested and sent to the vegetable farm. She nearly intervenes. They'll be put down, harvested. She steels herself. She can't save everyone. She chokes on a rolling cloud of dust and presses on. At the edge of the analog world, she places her palm over a holoscanner. Her silicone gloves fit like second skin. Their tips bear a set of 3D printed fingerprints. She's about to impersonate an analog gardener. A patrol drone scans her. The Carnatic Meridian sparks blue. A gap appears, electricity crackling on either side. She passes through the Meridian Gate. The light dims abruptly. A wave of cool thrushes over her. The sun shield umbrella orbits Apex City. It protects the virtual side from ultraviolet radiation, providing climatic conditions optimized for human performance. Her people are exposed to heat waves and dust storms. 26 towers form rank into the heart of the city. Thousands of employees are ensconced in biomat and frosted glass spirals, absorbed in holotech experiences. On the analog side, a block of pod houses shares a cellular phone. The arboretum curves on either side of her, all along the city's borders. Thousands of trees flower in desolation. Most analogs have no conception of a tree. She makes for the teleportals. Virtuals edge away from her grubby, shabbily dressed person. The port-pot's cyber arm vibrates in disgust when she produces paper money. She steps into a carbon fiber capsule. The 10% thief is molecularly reconstituted upon the estate of Sheila Prakash, a holotech mogul from the top 1% of society. Today, she has a bigger prize in mind. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, raise your hand. Yes, please.
Hello. Extremely fascinating discussion, and congratulations, Lavanya. I'm yet to read your book, but I'm impelled really, and I feel that's the next title I'm going to grab. I had a question, since we're talking about human experience, and I think it's, what really becomes problematic is when we are dealing with the frailties of human experience against such a landscape, which in a certain way becomes totalitarian. So when you talk about the experience of love, since I haven't read your book, I was just curious to know, how do you visualize the experience of love? Both the performance as well as the subversive part of love. Because I feel that always, historically speaking, love has had its subversions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your kind words and for your fantastic question. When I look at the experience of love, of course, love exists in so many different capacities in so many different ways on different levels. And if we are, there is a chapter in my book that deals with romantic love, for example, and it treats it in part as something that is genuine, but in another part as something that is performative. Because this is a totalitarian world where your choice of life partner is determined by so many things, including their appropriateness for you. So, if you are tremendously productive and belong to the top 20% of society, it is recommended that you also find a life partner who mirrors you in these capacities. So where is your element of choice in making this decision? How different is it from the world today when there are pressures on, there are religious pressures, there are social pressures and caste-driven pressures when it comes to expressing romantic love or choosing one's life partner. That disturbs me tremendously, and I've tried to sort of project that into the constraints of my world. Similarly, love on a more, I would say, on a less romantic scale, possibly more on a human experience, the care and empathy that we feel for each other. I believe a sense of community is all important, and the future of the world, against all of these crises, from rampant capitalism to climate change, is really going to be determined on our ability to recognize and respect differences, but still work together as a community. And that takes a certain degree of love, in my opinion. I would like to see that happen. In my book, of course, it is very difficult to make it happen, simply because the virtuals, who are the elite in my book, exist in these silos of very selfish human experience, with very limited interpersonal connections, unless they fuel success as an agenda, and success measured by productivity and by a certain elitist framework. Having said that, the analogs, who are the underprivileged in my book, who don't have access to technology and privilege, they work together as a community. They work with the sole purpose of bettering their lives by looking out for each other. And it is my hope that people can come together and do this as soon as possible. I would like to see this happen in the near future, and I'm very hopeful that it will, if not entirely optimistic. I hope that addresses your question. Thank you so much again.
if there are no other questions, I've just in case you do not know, this book is shortlisted for the WOW Awards. So please get your copy right from behind. It's at the Oxford Bookstore. Thank you, everyone present here. Thank you, Lavanya, for joining us. Thank you, Avik.
Thank you. Thank you very much.